The scream tore through the storm like a knife through flesh, and Margaret Hale knew that sound, knew it meant someone was dying in the Rio Sangre's crimson waters. It was 1876, and the Texas-New Mexico borderlands were a graveyard where the sun cooked bones and the mountains devoured hope. The river had swollen into a monster, churning red with mud and rage, and Margaret stood on her collapsing porch watching the world try to kill itself. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders had butchered her husband and left her alone in this hell. 3 years of asking herself why she stayed. 3 years of no answer. Then she heard the baby cry. Margaret's heart stopped. A baby. Out there. In that killing water. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had time. She just grabbed her coat and ran. The wind ripped her braid loose as her boots hit the muddy slope, and there, thrashing in the blood-red current, was a man clutching a leather basket with one arm, while his other clawed desperately at a broken log. Inside that basket, a tiny voice screamed for life. Margaret plunged in without hesitation, and the cold hit her like a fist. The current yanked at her skirts, trying to drag her under, but she seized a tangle of roots and pulled herself forward. The man was huge, broad-shouldered, his long dark hair plastered to a face carved with pain. Blood poured from gashes across his chest, turning the water around him darker. And Margaret's stomach twisted because she knew what he was before her mind could catch up. Comanche. The men who killed her husband. The enemy. The reason she woke up screaming some nights. But the baby's wail cut through her hatred like nothing else could. And when the man's grip faltered, Margaret lunged. Her hands closed on the basket just as the river surged, dragging them all under into a cold, red nightmare. Her lungs burned. The world spun. She kicked hard, broke the surface, and dragged the basket against her chest. The man was dead weight, unconscious, or dying. But Margaret hooked her arm under his shoulder anyway. She had no idea why. With strength she didn't know she had, she hauled them toward shore. Branches whipped her face, drawing blood. Her boots slipped in the sludge. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, until she collapsed on the rocks with the basket clutched tight, and the man sprawled beside her like a corpse. The baby screamed, alive, furious, perfect. The man didn't move at all. Margaret staggered up, her clothes weighing her down like chains. Her ranch was half a mile away, a pathetic square of rotting wood in an ocean of nothing. She slung the basket over her shoulder and looped the man's massive arm around her neck. He was heavy as a dead horse, but she gritted her teeth and started walking into the wind that cut through her like a blade made of ice and spite. Every step was war. The mud grabbed at her boots. Exhaustion clawed at her muscles. The horizon blurred as night came hunting. But that lantern light in her cabin window pulled her forward, one impossible step at a time, until she kicked open the door and collapsed inside. She laid the man on a straw pallet by the hearth. The baby she set on her own cot, peeling back the soaked leather to reveal a squalling infant no more than a month old, wrapped in deerskin. Its dark eyes locked onto hers, and for one terrible moment, Margaret's resolve cracked. What was she doing? Saving a Comanche? The same people who... She shook her head hard and stoked the fire until it roared. She tore strips from an old petticoat and boiled water to clean his wounds. The gashes were deep, bone deep, and his chest rose and fell unevenly, like something inside was broken. His hands were calloused from violence, his face marked with scars that told stories of men killed and battles survived. Margaret's fingers trembled as she worked, and her mind flashed to her husband's final moments. The raid, the blood, the screaming. She'd blamed men exactly like this one for 3 years of hell. Yet here she was, saving him. The baby's cries softened as she fed it goat's milk from a rag, her hands somehow steady despite the storm raging in her chest. Then the man's eyes flickered open, dark, sharp, exhausted, and his hand shot toward the knife at his belt. But his strength failed, and his arm fell limp. Margaret froze. Her own hand inched toward the rifle propped against the wall. Their eyes locked. 2 enemies. One fragile thread, a baby's life hanging between them. Outside, The Rio Sangre roared on, indifferent to the impossible truce forming in the firelight. And Margaret realized with cold certainty that this was only the beginning of something terrible. The firelight painted the cabin walls with dancing shadows that seemed to pulse with tension, and Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the Comanche warrior she'd dragged from death's jaws. His name, she'd later learn, was Natoka, though right now he was just the enemy, wounded and dangerous, lying 6 feet from where she sat. Margaret positioned herself by the hearth with the baby. Little Star, she'd named her in her head, cradled in one arm, and her rifle within easy reach of the other. Natoka's dark eyes tracked her every movement like a predator studying prey. His hand kept drifting to that bone-handled knife at his belt, fingers twitching, and Margaret knew he was measuring distances, calculating odds, wondering if he could kill her before she shot him. She'd seen eyes like his before, hard, unyielding, forged in loss and rage. These were the eyes of a man who'd watched his world burn at the hands of people who looked exactly like her. But Margaret's gaze was no softer. Her husband's blood-soaked body flashed through her mind. The Comanche raid, the screaming, the way his hand had gone cold in hers. 3 years hadn't dulled that memory one bit. Yet here they were, bound together by a baby's helpless cries. The cabin creaked under the wind's assault, and Margaret set Little Star in a makeshift cradle of blankets. She offered Natoka a tin cup of broth, steam curling like a ghost in the cold air. He stared at it. His jaw tightened. Then he pushed it away with slow, deliberate contempt. The rejection stung, but Margaret understood. To him, her food was poison. Her kindness was a trap. She turned away and busied herself with the fire, but kept the rifle in her peripheral vision because trust was a luxury neither could afford. The night dragged on in taut silence, broken only by burning mesquite popping and Little Star's soft whimpers. Natoka lay still, breathing unevenly, but his eyes never left her. Margaret slept in fragments, one hand on her rifle, the other near a skinning knife tucked under her cot. When dawn broke gray and cold, Margaret rose with bones aching from the river's toll, and checked the baby. Little Star's tiny hand gripped her finger. Such a small act, but it softened something in Margaret's chest she'd thought was dead. Natoka stirred, propping himself up despite the pain that carved deeper lines into his face. He spoke no English, but his gestures were clear as day. He wanted water. Margaret hesitated. Then she fetched a gourd from the barrel and set it just within his reach, close enough to drink, far enough to grab her rifle if needed. He drank slowly, never breaking eye contact, as if measuring her soul. She met his gaze with equal defiance. "You're alive," she said, her voice low and hard. "But don't think I trust you." The words hung unanswered, but the slight narrowing of his eyes told her he understood more than he let on, and that scared her more than anything. The day became a delicate dance around each other. Margaret milked the lone goat, feeling Natoka's stare burning into her back from the cabin door. He watched her haul wood, his silence louder than any threat. When Little Star wailed, both of them moved instinctively. Margaret to soothe, Natoka to check the child's wrappings. Their hands brushed. Both recoiled like they'd touched fire. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, old wounds, and the weight of blood spilled by people who looked like them. Yet the child's needs forced them into a grudging rhythm. Margaret boiled water. Natoka stoked the fire with his good arm. Every movement watched by the other like rival gunslingers waiting for someone to draw. Outside, the borderlands whispered danger. Hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond this fragile truce, a world of bounty hunters and militias who'd see Natoka's presence as treason and Margaret's mercy as betrayal. Margaret knew the rumors would spread like wildfire. Her name was already poison in the settlement for living alone, for refusing to remarry, for defying what a proper widow should be. Harboring a Comanche would brand her a traitor. Natoka seemed to sense the closing net too. He tested his strength, standing briefly before collapsing back. Frustration etched across his face. But Margaret caught something else in his eyes. Grief, maybe, for a life left behind in that river's red mud. By nightfall, the cabin felt smaller. The walls closed in with the weight of their shared history. All the raids, all the deaths, all the hatred passed down like poisoned heirlooms. Margaret sat by Little Star, humming a half-forgotten hymn to calm the child. Natoka watched, his knife now sheathed, but still close. The firelight caught the scars on his hands, each one a story of survival. Margaret's own hands bore calluses from years of brutal toil. Her wedding band was long gone, sold for seed that never took root in this cursed soil. In that moment, they weren't enemies. They were just two souls caught in the borderland's cruel grip, bound by a child who knew nothing of hatred and everything about need. The night stretched on, and the first cracks in their armor began to show. But neither could see that outside, in the darkness, someone was watching, and that observer would change everything. Margaret woke to the sound of a rider passing near the spring, too close, too deliberate, and when she checked at first light, she found boot prints in the mud. Fresh ones. Someone new. Her blood ran cold. Natoka noticed her tension immediately, his hand tightening on the hatchet he'd been using to split kindling. She pointed to the horizon where dust clouds hinted at riders in the distance. Multiple riders. Coming this way. "They come for me," Natoka said, and Margaret's heart nearly stopped because those were the first English words he'd spoken to her. Halting. Accented, but absolutely clear. He'd understood her all along. Margaret's mind raced. The settlement already whispered about her as a traitor for living alone, harboring a Comanche chief, because of course he was a chief. Her luck was just that cursed, would turn whispers into torches. They'd burn her ranch and hang them both, and Little Star would become just another orphan in a land that created them by the dozens. But as she looked at the baby sleeping soundly for the first time in days, something hardened inside her. She'd already lost her husband to violence. She wouldn't lose this innocent life to hatred. Night fell like an executioner's hood, and the cabin walls seemed to shrink. Margaret cleaned her rifle with deliberate movements while Natoka sharpened his knife, the scrape of stone on blade a steady rhythm against the fire's crackle. They were still enemies, their pasts a chasm too wide to cross, but Little Star's presence was a tether pulling them towards something that might have been purpose. The desert night stretched vast and merciless, but within the cabin, something fragile flickered. Not quite hope. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of understanding born from desperation, and the child who needed them both. Margaret woke before dawn to a coyote's howl, her hand reaching for the rifle by instinct. The fire had died to embers, casting a faint red glow over Natoka, who sat upright, sharpening his knife with movements that betrayed the pain still burning through his wounds. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the single window, with the focus of a man who knew death was coming. Those boot prints near the spring gnawed at Margaret's thoughts like rats. Someone was watching, and in the borderlands, secrets died violently. By midday, trouble arrived. Margaret stepped outside to check the goat pen, and that's when she saw them. Riders on the horizon, their shapes too deliberate to be travelers. Too many to be friends. She tightened her grip on the water bucket as her pulse hammered. Natoka emerged from the cabin, steadier now, the hatchet tucked in his belt. He followed her gaze, and his jaw set like granite. "Hunters," he said, his English rough but certain. "They want my head." Margaret nodded, throat dry. The bounty on a Comanche chief was worth more than her entire ranch, her livestock, her life. And the settlement had already branded her a traitor for sheltering him. Inside, they fortified their fragile sanctuary like soldiers preparing for siege. Margaret dragged the heavy table to block the door, its warped wood groaning under the strain. Natoka, using a broken chair leg as a crutch, checked the walls for weak spots, his movements precise despite the pain-carving lines across his face. Little Star slept fitfully in the cradle, unaware that violence was coming for them all. Margaret caught Natoka's eye as she loaded her rifle. "They'll come for me too," she said quietly. "For keeping you here." Natoka's gaze flickered, not with trust, but with something like respect for her defiance. The rumors had spread faster than prairie fire. Margaret's solitary life had already made her a pariah, a widow who refused to remarry or bend to the settlement's rules about proper women. Now, word had reached the militia that she was harboring a Comanche chief. A ragtag band of settlers and soldiers, itching for blood and bounty money, were riding her way. She'd overheard snippets from a passing trader the day before. "Hale's gone soft, hiding a savage." The words had cut deeper than she'd admit, but she pushed them aside. Keeping Little Star alive mattered more than her reputation. Natoka, sensing the noose tightening, spoke of his people for the first time. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder as he described raids that had cost him brothers, treaties broken by men with ink-stained hands and forked tongues. "Your kind took our rivers," he said, eyes fixed on the fire. Margaret bristled but held her tongue. Her own losses were too raw to argue. Instead, she offered a truth of her own. "My husband died fighting your kin, but he told me you weren't all monsters." The admission hung between them like a rope bridge over a chasm, fragile, swaying. But there. They worked through the afternoon, reinforcing the cabin with whatever they had. Margaret nailed boards over the window, leaving only a thin slit to watch the horizon. Natoka fashioned a crude spear from a broken fence post, his hands steady despite the fever lingering in his wounds. When Little Star cried, they took turns soothing her, a practiced dance born of necessity. The child was their shield, keeping the worst of their anger at bay. But the outside world cared nothing for such bonds. As dusk fell, the air grew thick with the scent of sagebrush and coming rain. Margaret spotted a glint of metal on the ridge, a rifle barrel catching the dying light. Her stomach dropped. The militia was closing in, their greed and fear more immediate than the desert's brutal embrace. Natoka stood beside her, his silhouette tall against the fading sun. "We fight, or we die," he said, voice steady as stone. Margaret nodded, hand tightening on her rifle. The cabin had been a refuge. Now it was a fortress. And the storm gathering beyond its walls would test more than their resolve. It would test whether two enemies could fight side by side and survive. But what neither of them knew was that the militia carried a secret darker than any they could imagine. And that secret would turn everything they thought they knew completely upside down. The militia's approach was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Their torches cut through the night like vengeful stars, and the desert air crackled with the scent of sagebrush and gunpowder. Margaret gripped her rifle, knuckles white, peering through the boarded window's narrow slit at 24 men forming a half circle around her cabin. Their leader, Captain Harrow, a barrel-chested man with a scar splitting his brow, bellowed her name like an accusation. "Margaret Hale, hand over the savage and his spawn, or we burn this traitor's den to ash." Margaret glanced at Natoka, his spear clutched tight, eyes burning with defiance that matched her own. Inside, Little Star whimpered, stirring in her cradle. Margaret's heart clenched, but she stood firm. She stepped to the door and flung it open. Torchlight bathed her in orange glow, her silhouette stark against the cabin's dark interior. "He's a man, not a trophy," she shouted into the wind. "This child's no prize for your bounties." The militia jeered, rifles glinting, but Natoka stepped forward, placing Little Star gently in Margaret's arms. He faced the mob, stance unyielding, ready to meet death on his own terms. The air grew thick. The moment teetered on violence's edge. Then a bounty hunter pushed through the crowd, his face half hidden by a tattered hat, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Harrow's got no claim to honor," he spat recklessly. "He sold guns to the Comanche, got their kin slaughtered for profit." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The militia faltered. Eyes darted to Harrow, whose face drained of color. Natoka's gaze sharpened, memory flashing to brothers lost in raids fueled by betrayal. Raids that shouldn't have happened, raids with weapons that came from somewhere. Margaret's breath caught. She'd heard rumors of corruption, but never this. Never the truth laid bare like a wound. Chaos erupted. A militiaman lunged at the bounty hunter, fists flying. Others turned on Harrow, their shouts drowning the wind. Margaret seized the moment, slamming the door shut and barring it with the table. Natoka grabbed his spear, moving swift despite his wounds. A shot rang out, splintering the door's edge. Margaret returned fire, her rifle's kick jarring her shoulder. Natoka hurled a chair through the window, shattering the boards, and thrust his spear at a shadow that ventured too close. The cabin became a battlefield. Together they fought, a desperate symphony of survival. Margaret reloaded with steady hands despite the chaos. Natoka guarded the door, his spear a blur of precision. Little Star's cries pierced the din, urging them forward. A torch sailed through the broken window, igniting a blanket. But Margaret smothered it with a bucket of water, her lungs burning from smoke. The militia's unity crumbled. Harrow's betrayal sowed doubt like poison. Some fled, their curses lost in the storm. Others pressed the attack, driven by greed. But Margaret and Natoka held firm, their shared purpose a shield against the onslaught. As first light broke, the militia retreated, their numbers thinned, their resolve broken. The cabin stood scarred but unbowed, the ground outside littered with spent shells and bloodstains. Margaret sank to the floor, rifle clattering beside her, exhaustion carving lines into her face. Natoka knelt by Little Star, his fingers brushing the child's cheek, eyes heavy with the weight of survival. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time, no hatred lingered in his gaze. Only quiet acknowledgement of their shared fight. But then Natoka did something that made Margaret's blood freeze. He stood slowly, cradling Little Star against his chest, and turned toward the door. Not as an enemy, not as an ally, but as a man with a secret he'd been carrying since the river. "The child," he said carefully, his English clearer now than it had been. "She is not mine." Margaret's world tilted. "What?" "Her mother," Natoka's voice broke. "Your people took her, soldiers, 3 days before the river. They killed her and left the baby. I found her crying in the mud." The cabin fell silent except for the wind outside. "The basket," Margaret whispered, pieces clicking together. "The leatherwork. That wasn't Comanche." Natoka shook his head slowly. "It was yours. White settler craft. The mother, she was running from something. Or someone. I tried to save them both. But I was too late." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. All this time, she'd assumed the baby was Comanche. That Natoka was protecting his own kin. But Little Star was a white child, orphaned by the very violence that had consumed them all, caught in the crossfire of a war with no clean sides, no simple heroes. "The men who killed her mother," Natoka continued, his voice heavy. "They wore uniforms, your uniforms. But they weren't hunting warriors. They were burning homesteads, taking land." Margaret's mind reeled. "Which homesteads?" "The ones west of here, where the water runs clean." Natoka's eyes hardened. "The ones your Captain Harrow wanted for himself." The final piece fell into place with sickening clarity. Harrow hadn't just sold guns to the Comanche. He'd been orchestrating violence on both sides, playing settlers and warriors against each other while he seized the best land for himself. The raids, the counter-raids, the cycle of death, all of it engineered by one man's greed. And Little Star's mother had been one of his victims, a settler who'd refused to sell her land, so Harrow had sent his militia to take it by force. Margaret lifted Little Star from Natoka's arms, her hands trembling. "We have to prove it." "How?" Natoka asked. "Who will believe a Comanche and a traitor widow?" Margaret's eyes hardened. "The bounty hunter, the drunk one who spilled Harrow's secret. He knows more. And if he talked once, he'll talk again." But before Natoka could respond, a voice called from outside, weak, pained, desperate. "Don't shoot! I'm unarmed!" Margaret peered through the shattered window. The bounty hunter from before lay in the dirt, clutching his side where blood seeped through his fingers. He'd been shot in the chaos, left behind by the retreating militia. "They'll kill me if I go back," he gasped. "Harrow knows I talked. Please, I got proof. Papers. In my saddlebag." Margaret and Natoka exchanged glances. It could be a trap. Probably was a trap. But if he had evidence, real evidence, it could change everything. "Cover me," Margaret said, checking her rifle. She stepped outside into the cold dawn, every nerve screaming danger. The bounty hunter's horse stood nearby, its saddlebag intact. Margaret moved quickly, rifle trained on the man while she rifled through the bag. Her fingers closed on a leather folder, and she pulled it out. Inside were letters, contracts, bills of sale, all signed by Captain Harrow, all detailing land purchases made immediately after Comanche raids destroyed the previous owners. And worse, orders for gun shipments sent to Comanche camps, with delivery schedules that matched every major raid in the past 3 years. Harrow had been arming his own enemies, creating the violence, profiting from the death. Margaret's hands shook as she returned to the cabin, papers clutched tight. "This proves everything," she breathed. The bounty hunter groaned from outside. "There's more. Harrow's got the sheriff paid off. Half the militia's in on it. You bring those papers to the settlement, they'll kill you before you reach the church." Natoka's jaw clenched. "Then we don't go to the settlement." "Where then?" Margaret demanded. "Fort Union," the bounty hunter rasped. 3 days north. Federal authorities. They'll listen. They have to." Margaret looked at Natoka, at Little Star, at the ruined cabin that had been her home. 3 days through open country with a wounded Comanche chief, a white baby, and evidence that would get them killed if caught. It was suicide. But staying here meant waiting for Harrow to return with more men, more guns, more fire. "We leave at sunset," Margaret decided. "Give us the cover of darkness." Natoka nodded grimly. "I'll gather supplies." Margaret turned to the bounty hunter, still bleeding in the dirt. "Can you ride?" He laughed bitterly. "Do I got a choice?" "No," Margaret said flatly. "But if you're lying, if this is a trap, I'll put a bullet in you myself." "Fair enough," he wheezed. They spent the day preparing for a journey that might kill them all. Margaret packed what little food they had: dried meat, cornmeal, a handful of coffee beans. Natoka fashioned a carrier for Little Star from deerskin and rope, something he could wear on his back while keeping his hands free. The bounty hunter, who finally gave his name as Cole, sat against the cabin wall and told them everything he knew about Harrow's operation. It was worse than they'd imagined. Harrow didn't just control the local militia. He had connections to territorial governors, land speculators, even railroad companies eager to seize indigenous territory. The violence in the borderlands wasn't random chaos. It was calculated, orchestrated, a machine that ground lives into profit. "How long have you known?" Margaret asked Cole. 6 months, he admitted. "I was just after the bounty money at first. Then I saw things, heard things, started putting pieces together." He coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Figured I'd get rich off the secret. Blackmail Harrow. But I got greedy. Drank too much. Talked too loud." "And now you're dying," Natoka said flatly. Cole nodded. "Probably. But maybe I can die meaning something." As sunset painted the sky red, the color of the Rio Sangre, the color of all the blood spilled in this cursed land, they mounted up. Margaret rode her lone horse, Little Star strapped to her chest. Natoka took Cole's horse, with Cole slumped behind him, barely conscious. The bounty hunter's horse carried their supplies. They rode north into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the cabin that had been a battlefield, a sanctuary, and a grave all at once. The first night was brutal. They didn't dare light a fire, knowing Harrow's men might be tracking them. They took turns keeping watch while Little Star fussed and cried, her small voice carrying too far in the still air. Margaret fed her drops of water and precious goat's milk, praying it would be enough. Cole's condition worsened. The bullet in his side was working deeper, and by the second day, fever had set in. He rambled incoherently about his childhood, about a sister he'd abandoned, about all the choices that had led him to bleed out in the desert. "Leave me," he gasped during a rest stop. "I'm slowing you down." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You're our witness. Without you, it's just our word against Harrow's." "My word's worth nothing," Cole laughed bitterly. "I'm a drunk and a killer." "Then maybe it's time to be something else," Natoka said quietly. On the third day, they saw the dust cloud behind them. Riders, multiple riders, coming fast. "Harrow," Margaret breathed. They pushed the horses harder, but Cole's mount was failing, exhausted from carrying double weight. Natoka made a decision that surprised them all. He dismounted, hoisted Cole onto the horse alone, and started running alongside. "You can't keep that pace!" Margaret protested. "I've run farther," Natoka said through gritted teeth. "Go!" They pushed forward, but the riders were gaining. Margaret could see them now, a dozen men, rifles glinting in the sun. Harrow's hunters, come to silence the evidence. The landscape shifted from desert scrub to rocky terrain as they approached Fort Union territory. Margaret spotted a canyon ahead, its walls steep and narrow. A defensible position, maybe their only chance. "There!" she shouted, pointing. They veered toward the canyon, horses stumbling on loose rock. Behind them, gunfire erupted, bullets whining off stone. Margaret returned fire over her shoulder, not aiming, just trying to slow them down. They reached the canyon mouth and dismounted, taking positions behind boulders. Cole collapsed, barely breathing. Little Star screamed, terrified by the noise. Natoka readied his spear, knowing it was useless against rifles but refusing to die unarmed. The militia reached the canyon entrance and stopped, smart enough not to charge into a bottleneck. Harrow rode to the front, his scarred face twisted with rage. "You think Fort Union will help you?" he shouted. "I got friends there too, friends everywhere. This territory belongs to men like me." "Not anymore!" Margaret shouted back. She held up the leather folder, visible against the sky. "We got your contracts, your letters, everything." Harrow's face went purple. "Those papers mean nothing without witnesses. And you're all dead." "Wrong," a new voice rang out. Margaret's heart nearly stopped as she saw them. Soldiers. Real federal soldiers. At least 20 of them. Rifles trained on Harrow's militia from the canyon's opposite rim. They must have heard the gunfire, sent a patrol to investigate. A lieutenant rode forward, his uniform crisp and official. "Captain Harrow, you and your men are under arrest for land fraud, weapons trafficking, and conspiracy to incite violence." Harrow's face went from purple to white. "You can't prove—" "We can," the lieutenant said calmly. "We've been investigating irregularities in this territory for 6 months. We just needed evidence, and witnesses." He nodded toward Margaret. "Sounds like you've got both." The militia broke. Some tried to run and were quickly surrounded. Others dropped their weapons and surrendered. Harrow sat on his horse, stunned, as soldiers put him in irons. Cole laughed weakly from where he lay bleeding. "Told you," he rasped. "Federal authorities." But the story wasn't over yet. There was one more twist that nobody, not even Margaret, saw coming. As the soldiers secured Harrow's men, the lieutenant approached Margaret, Natoka, and Cole. His eyes fell on Little Star, still strapped to Margaret's chest, and his expression changed. "Where did you get that child?" he asked quietly. Margaret's blood ran cold. She was orphaned. Her mother was killed." "When?" "6 days ago," Natoka answered. "By men in uniforms, west of here." The lieutenant's face went pale. "What did the mother look like?" Something in his voice made Margaret's hands shake. "We don't know. We never saw her. Just found the baby." The lieutenant reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes holding an infant. "This woman?" Margaret stared at the photo. "I don't know. Maybe." "Who is she?" "Was," the lieutenant corrected, his voice breaking. "My sister. Sarah. She and her husband were homesteading west of here. When they didn't answer my letters, I got worried. Requested assignment to this territory." His eyes glistened. "We found their burned-out cabin 3 days ago, both dead, but no baby. We thought she'd been taken. Or killed." Little Star chose that moment to reach up and grab Margaret's braid, gurgling happily. The lieutenant's composure shattered. "That's my niece," he whispered. "That's Emma." The world tilted. Little Star, Emma, wasn't just any orphan caught in the violence. She was family to the man who'd just saved their lives. Family to a federal officer who now owed them everything. Margaret carefully, slowly, unwrapped the carrier and held Emma out to the lieutenant. "She's yours," she said, though the words cut like knives. "She belongs with her family." The lieutenant took Emma with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. The baby fussed for a moment, then settled against his chest, recognizing something. Blood, maybe, or just the desperate love pouring off him in waves. "You saved her," he said to Margaret and Natoka. "Both of you. Enemies who became—" He couldn't finish. "Partners," Margaret supplied quietly. "For a little while." The lieutenant nodded, then straightened, wiping his eyes. "I can't change what happened to your people," he said to Natoka. "Or to your husband," he added to Margaret. "But I can make sure you're protected. Testify against Harrow. Help us clean up this territory. And I promise, things will change." It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was something. Cole died that night, fever taking him just as the sun set. His last words were to Margaret. "Tell my sister I'm sorry," Margaret promised, though she had no idea where Cole's sister was or if she even existed. Some promises were kept with intention, not results. The trial took 3 months. Margaret and Natoka testified in a federal courthouse, their words recorded by stern men in spectacles. Harrow and 12 of his associates were convicted of fraud, murder, and conspiracy. Harrow hanged. The others sent to territorial prison. The papers ran stories about the widow and the warrior who'd uncovered corruption in the borderlands. Some called them heroes. Others called them traitors to their own people. Margaret and Natoka didn't care much either way. When it was over, they stood outside the courthouse in Santa Fe, the city loud and strange around them. "What now?" Margaret asked. Natoka looked toward the mountains, toward the lands his people still fought to keep. "I go home. Try to stop more bloodshed. Use what I've learned." He paused. "You?" Margaret thought of her burned cabin, her empty ranch, her life of isolation. "Same, I suppose. Try to make something good out of all this death." They stood in awkward silence, 2 people who'd survived impossible odds together, but belonged to different worlds. "The child," Natoka said finally. "Emma? The lieutenant? He will raise her?" "With his wife," Margaret confirmed. "She'll have a good life, better than we could give." Natoka nodded. "She saved us," he said quietly. "By needing us. By being innocent when we were not." Margaret couldn't argue. They parted ways that afternoon. No dramatic goodbye, no promises to meet again. Just a nod of respect between 2 people who'd learned that enemies weren't always evil, and allies weren't always good. That the borderlands were complicated, painted in shades of red, blood and clay and sunset. And that sometimes survival meant letting go of hate long enough to save a life. Margaret returned to her ranch, or what was left of it. She rebuilt the cabin, this time with help from neighbors who'd heard the stories and saw her differently now. Not as a traitor, but as a woman who'd stood against corruption. She never remarried, never stopped missing her husband. But she stopped waking up screaming, and that felt like progress. She heard news of Natoka occasionally. He'd become a negotiator between the Comanche and the Federals, using his English and his knowledge of both worlds to broker truces. It didn't always work. Violence continued. But sometimes, they found peace without bloodshed. And that was something. Years later, Margaret received a letter from the lieutenant. Emma was thriving, he wrote. Smart as a whip, with her mother's eyes and a stubborn streak that reminded him of Margaret. He'd told Emma the story of her rescue, the widow and the warrior who'd pulled her from the river, who'd fought a corrupt militia, who'd given her a chance at life. "She wants to meet you someday," the letter concluded, "when she's older, to say thank you." Margaret folded the letter carefully and set it on her mantel, next to a photograph of her late husband. Outside, the Rio Sangre flowed peacefully, no longer swollen with rage. The borderlands were still hard, still unforgiving, but maybe, just maybe, a little less cruel than before. And in the desert night, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of a baby's cry that had changed everything, that had taken 2 enemies and made them something else, Not friends, not quite, but human. Beautifully, impossibly human. If you enjoyed this story of redemption found in the most unlikely places, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what you thought of Margaret and Natoka's journey. Could you forgive your enemy to save an innocent life? Let me know. And if you want more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the complicated truths of the American frontier, check out the playlist linked below. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show mercy when the whole world expects vengeance. See you in the next one.